Staff Sergeant Marcus Chen's boots scraped against the concrete walkway outside Building 4 to 2788, the main dining facility at Fort Bragg. 18 hours. 18 brutal, unrelenting hours of Hell Week training had hollowed him out completely. His BDU pants were caked with dried mud from the low-crawl course. His shoulders ached from the ruck march. His eyes burned with exhaustion so profound that the fluorescent lights of the mess hall entrance seemed to pulse and swim before him. All he wanted was food. Just food. Hot food. Any food. Chen had been doing this for 12 years. Enlisted straight out of high school in Sacramento. Shipped to basic at Fort Benning. Survived Ranger School on his second attempt. Deployed 3 times to Afghanistan and once to Iraq. He had seen friends die in Helmand Province. He had called in medevacs with hands slick with someone else's blood. He had earned every stripe on his sleeve through sweat, sacrifice, and moment of terror that still visited him at 0300 when the barracks were quiet. But right now, none of that mattered. Right now, Staff Sergeant Marcus Chun was a 34-year-old man running on fumes, and the only coherent thought rattling around his skull was the promise of whatever protein the Army's culinary specialists had managed to render somewhat edible tonight. He pushed through the double doors. The mess hall hummed with the controlled chaos of evening chow. Soldiers in various states of exhaustion lined up along the serving stations. The clatter of trays, the murmur of conversation, the industrial hum of the ventilation system, it all blended into white noise that Chen barely registered. His tunnel vision locked onto the serving line, like a targeting computer acquiring its mark. 30 meters, 20 meters, 10. He was almost there, and then he saw her. A small woman in rumpled ACU stood frozen at the serving station, her tray extended but her body completely still. She wasn't moving. She was blocking the entire line, staring at the serving soldier like she was trying to solve a calculus problem written in the mashed potatoes. Chen's exhausted brain performed a rapid assessment. Small frame, maybe 5'4", no visible rank insignia on her patrol cap. Shoulders slightly slumped in that distinctive way new arrivals carry themselves before the Army either broke them or built them. New private, his mind concluded, fresh off the bus from AIT. Probably got lost on her way to in-processing and wandered in here looking confused. She still wasn't moving. Behind Chun, 23 other hungry soldiers waited in a line that stretched back toward the drink station. He could feel their collective impatience radiating against his back like heat from a furnace. "Hey," Chin said, his voice rough from dehydration and exhaustion. "Move it along." The woman didn't respond, didn't turn, didn't even acknowledge she'd heard him. Something snapped in Chen's overtaxed nervous system. 12 years of discipline, 3 combat deployments, and a service record that would make most soldiers weep with envy. None of it mattered in that singular moment of catastrophic decision-making. He reached forward and shoved. Not hard, not violently. Just a firm push against her shoulder blade. The kind of aggressive encouragement one exhausted NCO might give to a spacing-out private who needed to get her head out of her 4th point of contact. The woman stumbled forward 2 steps, catching herself against the serving counter. And the mess hall went silent. Not quiet. Silent. The kind of silence Chun had only ever heard in the heartbeat between an IED detonation and the screaming that followed. The kind of silence that preceded very bad things. If that opening hooked you, buckle up. This story only gets more intense from here. Subscribe now for more real stories of courage and hit that notification bell. Now, let me take you back to what happened in that frozen mess hall. Chen's hand was still extended in the air, fingers splayed from the shove, when he noticed the first anomaly. Specialist Torres, a supply clerk who never stopped talking, had dropped his fork mid-bite. His mouth hung open like he'd just watched someone walk on water. The second anomaly was Sergeant First Class Williams, a 22-year veteran who had seen things in Fallujah that would haunt a lesser man's nightmares. Williams had gone pale, chalk white, like he was witnessing an execution. The third anomaly was the serving soldier behind the counter. A private first class who had been robotically scooping vegetables for the past 3 hours suddenly looked like he was about to cry. Chen's exhaustion-addled brain struggled to process these data points into a coherent threat assessment. Something was wrong. Something was very wrong. But his cognitive functions were running at maybe 40% capacity, and the equation wasn't solving. The woman turned around. She was older than he'd initially estimated. Late 40s, maybe early 50s, with silver threading through dark hair that was pulled back in a regulation bun. Her face was weathered in that distinctive way of people who had spent years in harsh environments. Desert sun, mountain cold, the particular stress that came from making decisions that determined whether soldiers lived or died. But it was her eyes that made Chen's stomach drop to the floor and into whatever subterranean level of Fort Bragg's infrastructure existed beneath the mess hall. Those eyes held no surprise, no offense, no anger. They held evaluation. The woman was studying him the way a surgeon might study an X-ray, cataloging every detail with clinical precision. The mud on his boots, the exhaustion in his posture, the hand still hovering in the air from the shove, the dawning horror spreading across his features. She reached up slowly, deliberately, and removed her patrol cap. Chun saw the hairline, then the silver oak leaves that should have been there, but weren't, because this wasn't a lieutenant colonel. The woman's collar was bare, intentionally bare, but as she set her patrol cap on the serving counter, Chun noticed what he should have seen immediately, the way every soldier in his peripheral vision had stiffened to attention without being commanded, the way the air itself seemed to have changed density, the way his own body was beginning to tremble with something far beyond exhaustion. "Staff Sergeant," she said. Her voice was quiet, measured, the kind of quiet that preceded artillery barges. "I believe you just put hands on a senior officer." The mess hall remained frozen. 247 soldiers, Chin would learn the exact number later, had witnessed what would become the most infamous 3 seconds in Fort Bragg's recent memory. Behind the counter, the serving PFC finally moved. He reached beneath the serving station and produced a small case that he'd apparently been instructed to keep hidden. Inside the case, resting on red velvet, were 2 silver stars. Major General. The woman was a Major General. Chen's knees nearly buckled. His vision tunneled further, but not from exhaustion this time. From the absolute, world-ending realization that he, Staff Sergeant Marcus Chun, had just physically shoved a 2-star general in front of an audience that included what appeared to be half the installation's evening chow population. "Ma'am," he managed. The word came out like gravel being pushed through sandpaper. "I don't." She held up one hand. "Not here. Not now." She picked up her tray, selected the same mashed potatoes she'd been contemplating before Chun had committed career suicide, and walked calmly toward an empty table in the corner. Every head in the mess hall tracked her movement, then swiveled back to Chun like spectators at a tennis match waiting for the return serve. The return serve didn't come. Chun stood rooted to the spot, his tray forgotten, his appetite destroyed, his 12-year career flashing before his eyes in a highlight reel of everything he was about to lose. Staff Sergeant Chun. A voice materialized at his elbow. He turned to find Sergeant Major Daniels, the installation's senior enlisted advisor, standing close enough to whisper. Daniels' face was a mask of professional neutrality, but his eyes communicated volumes. "You need to leave. Now. Report to Colonel Briggs's office at 0530 tomorrow. Bring your service record." Chin nodded numbly. "And Chun?" Daniels leaned closer. "You should know who that is before you walk into that meeting. Major General Sarakavik. She took command of this installation 72 hours ago. She earned those stars in places that aren't on any map. Do you understand what I'm telling you?" Chin didn't. Not fully. But he understood enough. He walked out of the mess hall without his dinner. The walk back to his barracks felt like a death march. Each step carried the weight of consequences he couldn't yet calculate, but could certainly feel approaching like a storm front. His barracks room was a 10-by-12 cell of Army-issue furniture and personal effects that suddenly seemed meaningless. Photos from his deployments. His Ranger tab, framed and mounted on the wall. The Challenge coin collection that traced a career through 3 continents and 2 decades. All of it, everything he'd built, everything he'd sacrificed for, could be erased by a single signature from a general he'd shoved in a chow line. Chin sat on his rack and stared at the wall until 0200. Sleep didn't come. How could it? His mind replayed the incident on an endless loop, each iteration more horrifying than the last. The push, the silence, her eyes, the stars, the absolute certainty that his career was over. At 0400, he stopped trying to sleep, He showered, shaved, and donned his classy uniform, the dress uniform reserved for ceremonies, boards, and moments of institutional judgment. If he was going to face a firing squad, he would face it properly dressed. At 0515, he stood outside Building 1 to 3340, Colonel Briggs's headquarters. The pre-dawn darkness of Fort Bragg pressed against him like a physical weight. Somewhere across the installation, PT formations were beginning their morning runs. Normal soldiers doing normal things on what was, for them, a normal day. Chun had never felt less normal in his life. At 0530 exactly, he knocked on Colonel Briggs's door. Enter. Chun pushed through the door and immediately reported in the manner prescribed by regulation. Staff Sergeant Chun Marcus, reporting as ordered, sir. Colonel Briggs was a lean man in his early 50s with the particular weathered look of someone who had spent his career in infantry units. He sat behind his desk with his fingers steepled, studying Chun with an expression that combined professional detachment with something that might have been pity. At ease, Staff Sergeant. Closed the door. Chun obeyed, then assumed the parade rest position that felt more like a prisoner awaiting sentencing. Do you know why you're here? Yes, sir. The incident in the mess hall, sir. Briggs nodded slowly. The incident in the mess hall. That's one way to describe it. He reached into a folder on his desk and extracted several documents. Before we discuss consequences, I need you to understand exactly what you did. Not the act itself. We both know you shoved a general. But who you shoved. Sit down. Chun sat. His spine remained rigid, but his legs appreciated the relief. Major General Sarah Cavac. Briggs began, his voice taking on the reverent tone of a historian describing ancient battles. 49 years old. Commissioned through ROTC at Texas A&M in 1996. Infantry branch. One of the first women to successfully complete the infantry officer basic course after the combat exclusion policy ended. Ranger qualified in 2013 at age 40, which makes her the oldest woman ever to earn that tab. Chin felt his stomach descend another level. Ranger qualified at 40. Most soldiers in their 20s couldn't survive that course. He'd barely survived it himself at 24. Briggs continued reading from the file. 2 combat tours in Afghanistan, 1 in Iraq. Commanded a company during the Battle of Wannet in 2008. You know that name? Chin knew it. Every infantryman knew it. Wanted had been one of the most intense firefights of the Afghan War, a small outpost nearly overrun by hundreds of insurgents. She was a captain then, Briggs said. Her unit was attached to the main element for reinforcement. When the attack began, she led her soldiers through 3 kilometers of enemy fire to reach the position, killed 11 combatants personally, evacuated 4 wounded soldiers on her own back when her vehicles were disabled. Silver Star number 1. The room seemed to shrink around Chun. 3 years later, Captain Cavac, now Major Cavac, commanded a battalion task force during a recovery operation in the Korengal Valley. You know the Korengal? The Valley of Death. Every soldier who'd served in Afghanistan knew that name too. Down helicopter. For crew members trapped. Enemy forces converging from 3 directions. She had orders to wait for air support. Air support that was 45 minutes out. The crew would have been dead in 20. Briggs paused, letting the weight of the scenario settle. She disobeyed those orders. Led 23 soldiers into that valley, through ambush positions that intelligence said were impossible to breach. Lost 2 men getting in. Lost 1 more getting out. But all 4 crew members survived. Sir, Chin said, his voice barely above a whisper, she disobeyed orders? Briggs's lips thinned. She made a command decision under impossible circumstances. Silver Star number 2. Bronze Star with valor for the overall operation. And the official reprimand that should have ended her career was mysteriously lost somewhere in the administrative process. He closed the folder. That woman has forgotten more about leadership sacrifice and moral courage than most soldiers will ever learn. And yesterday, you shoved her because she was taking too long in a chow line. Chun had no response. What response was possible? She designed this, Briggs said quietly. Sir, General Cavac designed scenario. She arrived at Fort Bragg 3 days ago. Normally, a 2-star general makes their presence known immediately. Formation ceremonies, the whole dog and pony show. She refused. She wanted 72 hours of anonymity first. Chen's confusion must have shown on his face. She wanted to see how soldiers behave when they think no one important is watching, Briggs explained. She went to the motor pool at 0300 and watched mechanics work on vehicles. She observed a training exercise from the tree line without identifying herself. She attended a chapel service in civilian clothes. And yesterday evening, she went to mess hall in unmarked ACUs to see how soldiers treated each other and her when rank was invisible. The implications crashed over Chun like a wave. She'd been testing them, all of them, and he'd become the test's most spectacular failure. 247 soldiers passed through that mess hall while she was there. Briggs continued. Most ignored her. Some made eye contact and nodded respectfully, basic human courtesy. A few asked if she needed help finding her unit. One specialist actually offered to carry her tray. Chin closed his eyes. And then there was you. Sir, I'm not finished. Briggs's voice hardened. You didn't just bump into her accidentally. You didn't say, excuse me, and reach around her. You put your hands on another soldier, a soldier you assumed was subordinate because she was small, female, and blocking your path to dinner. You made assumptions based on appearance and acted on them physically. The silence that followed was heavier than any reprimand Chun had ever received. Because Briggs wasn't wrong. Chun could dress the incident in exhaustion and circumstance, but the core truth remained. He had looked at a small woman in unmarked uniform and decided she was beneath his patience. General Kavik would be within her rights to end your career this morning, Briggs said. Article 134, Conduct Unbecoming. Article 128, Assault. Administrative separation with prejudice. You would lose your benefits, your retirement trajectory, everything you built over 12 years. Chin felt the words like physical blows. Yes, sir. She's not going to do that. Chin looked up sharply. Sir, don't ask him to explain her reasoning. I've known her for 4 hours, and I've already learned she operates on a different level than most commanders I've served under. But she's reviewed your record. 3 deployments, all excellent. Ranger tab. 2 Army Commendation Medals. Your encoders have consistently rated you among the top 5% of your peers. Briggs leaned back in his chair. She sees something in you, Chun. Something worth salvaging. Whether that's wisdom or foolishness on her part, we're about to find out. What does that mean, sir? It means you're going to meet with her directly. Right now. Her office is 2 doors down. Chen's heart rate, which had begun to stabilize, immediately spiked again. Now, sir, did I stutter, Staff Sergeant? No, sir. Chen rose from the chair, his dress uniform suddenly feeling like armor too heavy to bear. Thank you, sir. Don't thank me yet. What happens next is entirely between you and the general. My recommendation? Briggs met his eyes. Whatever she offers you, take it, because the alternative is the end of everything. Chin walked the 23 steps between Colonel Briggs's office and General Kavik's door like a condemned man approaching the gallows. Each step felt significant. Final. The hallway was empty at this hour, the administrative staff not yet arrived, and the silence amplified his footsteps into thunderclaps. He stopped outside her door. Major General Sarah Kavik, the nameplate read, Commanding General Fort Bragg. Chin raised his hand to knock. The door opened before his knuckles made contact. She stood in the doorway, no longer in rumpled ACUs, but in the Army service uniform that made her 2 stars impossible to miss. Without the concealing patrol cap, her face was fully visible. Those evaluating eyes, the weathered skin, the silver threading through her dark hair. She looked smaller than he remembered from the mess hall, but somehow more commanding. The paradox made his head hurt. Staff Sergeant Chun, she said, come in. Her office was spartanly decorated, boxes still stacked in the corners from her recent arrival. A single photograph hung on the wall behind her desk. A group of soldiers in Afghanistan, covered in dust and exhaustion, but grinning at the camera with a particular joy of survivors. Chun recognized the terrain immediately, the Karengal Valley. Sit, she said, gesturing to a chair positioned directly across from her desk. Chun sat. His spine remained painfully straight. General Kavik settled into her own chair and studied him for a long moment without speaking. The silence was uncomfortable, but Chin suspected that was the point. He had learned over 12 years that good commanders understood the tactical value of silence. 18 hours, she finally said. That's how long your Hell Week rotation had been running when you came into the mess hall. Yes, ma'am. You completed a 12-mile ruck march with 65 pounds, a stress course, 2 hours of combatives, a live fire exercise that ran 40 minutes over schedule because of equipment failure. She was reading from a tablet on her desk, but Chun had the distinct impression she'd memorized every detail. The last time you ate was a protein bar at 0400 that morning. Yes, ma'am. So when you saw a small woman blocking the serving line, a woman you perceived as a new private who didn't understand mess hall protocol, your exhausted brain made a decision your rested brain would never have made. Chin hesitated. Ma'am, with respect, I'm not sure that's entirely true. Kavak's eyebrows rose. It was a small movement, but Chin registered it as dangerous. My exhaustion contributed to my decision, he continued, choosing each word with surgical precision. But the decision itself came from somewhere deeper. I looked at you, ma'am, and I made assumptions. Small, female, unmarked uniform. Therefore, subordinate. Therefore, someone I didn't need to respect. Therefore, someone I could push. The room was silent for 3 heartbeats. That's honest, Kavak said finally. Brutally honest. Most soldiers in your position would hide behind circumstance. Hiding behind circumstance would be easy, ma'am. But it wouldn't be true. Kavak leaned back in her chair, her expression unreadable. Colonel Briggs told you about my career? Yes, ma'am. The highlights, at least. The highlights. She smiled, but there was no warmth in it. The highlights are what get written on citations and carved into memorial walls. The reality is always Messier. She gestured toward the photograph behind her desk. That picture was taken 6 hours after the Coringal operation. We just extracted the down crew. I'd lost 3 soldiers getting in and out of that valley. 3 soldiers whose families I personally notified within 24 hours. The men in that photograph are smiling because they're alive. I'm smiling because I hadn't started counting costs yet. Chun didn't know how to respond. I tell you this because I want you to understand something, Kavak continued. My career isn't defined by medals or rank. It's defined by decisions, some good, some catastrophic. Every leader fails. Every leader makes choices that haunt them. The question isn't whether you'll fail. The question is what you do after. She pulled a folder from her desk drawer. Chen's service record, judging by the thickness. Staff Sergeant Marcus Chun, 12 years of service. Ranger tab, 3 combat deployments. Consistently rated in the top 5% of your peer group. She flipped through pages. Your last NCOER calls you a naturally gifted leader with exceptional tactical instincts. Your company commander wrote that you possess a potential for senior leadership positions. She closed the folder. And yesterday, you shoved a general in a mess hall because she was in your way. Yes, ma'am. Here's my dilemma, Staff Sergeant. I came to Fort Bragg with a mission. This installation trains more combat soldiers than anywhere else in the United States. The culture here ripples outward to every unit those soldiers eventually join. If the culture is toxic, that toxicity spreads army-wide. If the culture is healthy, that health spreads too. She stood and walked to her window, which overlooked one of the main parade fields. Morning PT formations were beginning to assemble in the distance, hundreds of soldiers in synchronized movement. I removed my rank deliberately, she said, watching the formations. I wanted to see what this installation looks like when no one thinks leadership is watching. And what I found was mostly positive. Soldiers helping each other. NCOs mentoring privates. Professionals doing their jobs with pride. She turned back to face him. And then I found you, the exception. The soldier who decided that his exhaustion and hunger entitled him to put hands on another human being without consequence. The soldier who looked at a fellow service member and saw an obstacle rather than a person. Chun felt each word like a physical blow. Because she was right. She was completely, devastatingly right. I have 2 options, Kavak continued. Option 1 is simple. I filed the paperwork tonight, and by next week, you're processing out with general discharge. Your career ends. Your benefits are compromised. Everything you built over 12 years becomes a cautionary tale about what happens when NCOs lose their bearing. Chen's throat tightened. Option 2 is harder. For both of us. She returned to her desk and pulled out a second folder, this one much thinner, containing only a few typed pages. I've designed a program. 30 days, dual duty. You'll continue your normal training schedule during the day. Every drill, every exercise, every obligation your unit requires. From 1800 to 2300 each night, you'll work directly with my staff and me on a project I've been developing since my first command. What kind of project, ma'am? Leadership curriculum. Kavik slid the folder across the desk. We're going to build a training program together. Staff Sergeant. A program that teaches NCOs what you clearly never learned. That rank is earned, but respect is given. That every soldier, regardless of their size, gender, or visible insignia, deserves basic human dignity. That leadership isn't about who you command. It's about who you are when no one's watching. Chin opened the folder. The title page read, Dignity Through Leadership, a framework for ethical NCO development. You want me to help build a curriculum about the exact thing I failed at? I want you to become the curriculum. Kavik's eyes locked onto his. The most powerful teachers are the ones who failed and rebuilt themselves. Anyone can lecture about respect from a position of perfection, but a soldier who publicly humiliated himself and then transformed? That soldier can reach people no textbook ever will. Chin stared at the folder. 30 days of dual duty meant roughly 3 hours of sleep per night. It meant physical and mental exhaustion beyond anything Hell Week could deliver. It meant functioning at minimum capacity while simultaneously developing something meaningful. The program will be brutal, Kavik continued, as if reading his thoughts. You'll operate at the edge of your capabilities for 30 consecutive days. You'll question whether it's worth it. You'll want to quit. You'll have moments where option one, the easy discharge, the clean ending, sound like mercy. Why are you offering me this, ma'am? The question was out before Chin could stop it. It was insubordinate, perhaps, but he needed to understand. Kavik was silent for a long moment. Because I've been where you are, she said quietly. Not the exact same circumstances, but close enough. 30 years ago, I was a second lieutenant who made a catastrophic decision that nearly killed 3 soldiers under my command. Not from malice, from arrogance, from believing I knew better than my senior NCOs, from assuming my rank entitled me decisions I wasn't qualified to make. She returned to the window. My commander at the time was a captain named Rodriguez. She could have ended my career that day. The paperwork was already drafted, but instead, she offered me a choice. And I took the harder path. Spent 6 months rebuilding myself from the ground up, learning to listen, learning to respect the experience of soldiers who'd been in service before I was born, learning that leadership is about service, not authority. She turned back to face him. Captain Rodriguez is dead now, IED in Iraq in 2007, but she saved my career before it started. She saw something in me worth salvaging, and now I see something in you. Her voice hardened. Don't make me wrong about that, Staff Sergeant. Chin looked at the folder in his hands. 30 days, 3 hours of sleep, the complete reconstruction of his understanding of leadership and respect, or the clean death of his career. No struggle, no suffering, just an ending. Ma'am, he said slowly, if I'm honest, and you seem to value honesty, I'm not sure I deserve this opportunity. You don't. Kavik's response was immediate. That's the point. This isn't about what you deserve. This is about what you can become. The question is whether you're brave enough to try. Brave enough. Chin had jumped from aircraft at 15,000 feet. He had engaged enemy combatants at ranges so close he could see their eyes. He had performed first aid on wounds that should have been fatal, hands steady, voice calm, doing the job because soldiers depended on him. But this felt more terrifying than any of it, because this wasn't about physical courage. This was about dismantling the parts of himself he'd never examined and rebuilding them into something better. I'm in, he heard himself say. Ma'am, I choose option 2. Kavik nodded slowly. Report to building 2 to 4,165 at 1800 tonight. That's the Professional Development Center. Bring paper and pen. We start immediately. Yes, ma'am. Chin rose to leave, but her voice stopped him at the door. Staff Sergeant, one more thing. He turned. This program doesn't exist on any official record yet. There's no administrative trail, no documentation of your participation. If you fail, if you quit at any point over the next 30 days, option 1 reactivates automatically. Do you understand? Yes, ma'am. Then I'll see you at 1800. Don't be late. The next 30 days became a blur of exhaustion, revelation, and pain that Chen would remember for the rest of his life. Day 1 began at 1800 hours in a conference room with General Kavik, a command sergeant major named Reeves, and 2 civilian consultants who specialized in organizational psychology. They spent 5 hours that first night doing nothing but talking, analyzing the mess hall incident from every conceivable angle. Walk me through your thought process, Dr. Martinez, the lead consultant, instructed. Not the decision itself, the thoughts that preceded it, the assumptions your brain made before you consciously chose to act. Chen struggled to articulate something he'd never examined. I saw a soldier blocking my path. I assumed she was Junior. I decided she was an obstacle. Why Junior? Because he stopped. The honest answer was ugly, but Kavik had demanded honesty. Because she was small, female. Her uniform was unmarked. She looked uncertain. And uncertainty means Junior? In my experience, yes. Experienced soldiers move with confidence. New soldiers hesitate. So you associate hesitation with inexperience. Inexperience with junior rank. And junior rank was someone you could physically move without consequence. The clinical dissection of his thought process was devastating. Each assumption revealed another, each layer uglier than the last. Here's what you didn't consider, Kavik interjected. A senior officer in an unfamiliar environment might also hesitate. A combat veteran experiencing a PTSD trigger might freeze. A soldier receiving devastating personal news might stand immobile while processing grief. Hesitation has infinite causes. You saw only one. They worked until 2300. Chen drove back to his barracks in a fog of mental exhaustion layered atop physical fatigue. He set his alarm for 0400, knowing he had PT formation at 0600. 3 hours of sleep, then up to do it all again. Day 2 through 7 established a brutal rhythm that would define the program. Normal training during the day, which included a field exercise that ran 48 continuous hours, followed by evening sessions that ranged from theoretical discussion to practical exercises. On day 4, Kavik introduced a core framework they would build together. Dignity through leadership, she said, writing the phrase on a whiteboard. 3 components: recognition, respect, responsibility. Every interaction a leader has with subordinate, or anyone they perceive as subordinate, should pass through these filters. Recognition, the conscious acknowledgement that every person has value beyond their visible rank or role. Respect, the behavioral commitment to treat others with courtesy regardless of circumstance or stress. Responsibility, the leader's obligation to model the behavior they expect from others. Your failure in the mess hall, Kavik continued, represented a failure at all 3 levels. You didn't recognize me as a person worthy of patience. You didn't respect my physical space. And you didn't take responsibility for your stress by managing appropriately. Chen wrote everything down. His hand cramps became permanent fixtures. His brain felt like overstress equipment, still functional, but operating well beyond recommended parameters. Day 8 brought a new element, practice teaching. You're going to teach this material to others, Command Sergeant Major Reeves announced. Starting tonight. Building 3 to 2,200. 20 NCOs from the 82nd Airborne who volunteered for professional development. You have 2 hours to present recognition. Chen's exhausted mind rebelled. Sergeant Major, I've had less than 20 hours of sleep in the past week. I can barely form coherent sentences, let alone teach. Then you'd better figure it out. Reeves's expression was granite. Combat doesn't wait until you're well rested. Leadership certainly doesn't. General Kavik is trusting you with real soldiers. Don't fail her. The first teaching session was a disaster. Chen stumbled through his material. His examples were weak. His confidence was non-existent. The 20 NCOs in the room, sergeants and staff sergeants from various units, watched it with expressions ranging from boredom to pity. But he didn't quit. Day 9 session was slightly better. Day 10 better still. By day 12, Chen was beginning to understand something fundamental about teaching. It wasn't about perfection. It was about authenticity. During one session, a sergeant named Williams asked directly, "Staff Sergeant Chen, why are you teaching this? What makes you qualified to talk about dignity?" Chen could have deflected, could have cited his combat experience or his service record. Instead, he told the truth. Because I failed at it completely. 3 weeks ago, I shoved a general in a mess hall because I assumed she was a new private blocking my dinner. I was exhausted, stressed, and I made assumptions based on her appearance. Every principle I'm teaching you tonight comes from something I personally violated. The room went silent. Then Williams nodded slowly. That's real, he said. I can learn from that. General Kavik observed the session from the back of the room. After the NCOs departed, she approached Chun. You understand now, she said quietly. The power isn't in presenting perfection. It's in admitting failure and showing reconstruction. That's what they'll remember. The middle weeks of the program blurred together. Day 14 through 21 included developing case studies, refining presentation materials, and undergoing a grueling series of scenario exercises where Chin had to practice the principles he was teaching in real-time stressful situations. One exercise involved an actor playing an extremely frustrating junior soldier, whining, making excuses, testing every limit of patience. Chen's job was to maintain dignity and respect regardless of provocation. He failed the first 3 attempts. Your stress response is physical, Dr. Martinez observed after watching recordings of Chen's failures. When your cortisol spikes, you default to authority displays. Raised voice, aggressive posture. You're not even aware you're doing it. They spent 4 nights working on stress recognition and management. Chen learned to identify the physical precursors to his aggressive responses, the jaw tension, the shoulder elevation, the shallow breathing, and developed intervention techniques to short-circuit the pattern. Day 20 brought the breaking point. Chen had been operating on an average of 3 hours of sleep per night for almost 3 weeks. His body was beginning to fail. His judgment was compromised. During a daytime training exercise, he had walked directly into a door frame he should have easily navigated. That night, sitting in the conference room at Building 2 to 4165, he looked at General Kavik and felt something crack. Ma'am, I can't do this anymore. The words came out before he could stop them. I'm hallucinating from sleep deprivation. I walked into a wall today. I've lost 15 pounds because I don't have time to eat properly. My performance in my regular duties is suffering. My team leader pulled me aside yesterday and asked if I was having personal problems. His voice broke slightly. I'm failing at everything, trying not to fail at this. Kavik said nothing. The easy path, the discharge you offered, sounds like relief right now. Just ending this, accepting the consequences, and moving on, starting over somewhere else as a civilian. He laughed bitterly. Do you know how insane that sounds? I have 12 years invested in this career, and right now, walking away feels easier than continuing. The silence stretched. Are you finished? Kavik asked. Yes, ma'am. Good. Because I need you to hear something. She leaned forward. Everything you're feeling right now, every doubt, every physical breakdown, every moment of want to quit, that's exactly what you need to experience. Chin stared at her. Leadership isn't tested when you're well-rested and comfortable. It's tested exactly now, when you have nothing left, when your body is failing and your mind is compromised and every rational instinct says to quit. Her voice softened. I didn't design this program to be survivable through talent. I designed it to break you so you could rebuild stronger. And if I don't survive it, then you weren't the soldier I thought you were. And option 1 was the right choice all along. Chin sat in silence, feeling the weight of exhaustion pressing down on every cell of his body. You said you want to quit, Kavik continued. That's honest. But before you make that decision, I need you to answer one question. What question? In the mess hall, when you shoved me, you were exhausted, stressed beyond rational function, operating on fumes. She met his eyes. Are you a different person now than you were then? Or has all of this meant nothing? The question hit Chen like a physical blow. Because he wanted to say yes, wanted to believe he had transformed into something better. But the honest answer was that he didn't know. He hadn't been tested yet. Not really. The teaching sessions, the theory, the practice exercises, none of it replicated the actual conditions under which he had failed. I don't know, he admitted. I don't know if I'm different. Then let's find out. Kavik stood and walked to the conference room door. She opened it, revealing Command Sergeant Major Reeves waiting in the hallway. Sergeant Major, she said, Please initiate exercise meridian. Chun felt a spike of adrenaline cut through his exhaustion. What's exercise meridian? The final test. Kavik returned to her seat. We're going to recreate the conditions of your original failure. Exhaustion, stress, time pressure, and a scenario designed to provoke exactly the response you showed in the mess hall. If you pass, you graduate the program. If you fail, she didn't need to finish the sentence. Reeves led Chun outside to a waiting vehicle. They drove across Fort Bragg in darkness, the installation's roads empty at 0100 hours. Chun had no idea where they were going, no idea what the exercise would involve, and no energy left to ask questions. They arrived at the installation's training compound, a complex of buildings designed to simulate urban combat environments. Chun had trained here dozens of times, clearing rooms and executing tactical maneuvers. But tonight felt different. Tonight, the buildings loomed with menace. Ground rules, Reeves said. For the next 4 hours, you will navigate a series of scenarios designed to test your application dignity through leadership principles. You will be exhausted, more exhausted than you were in the mess hall. You will be stressed. You will be provoked by actors trained to trigger your aggressive responses. Your job is simple. Do not fail. What constitutes failure? You'll know it when it happens, or when it doesn't. They entered the compound. The first scenario involved a simulated checkpoint. Chun, playing the role of senior NCO, had to process a series of soldiers through a verification procedure. The soldiers, actually actors, presented various challenges. One was belligerently drunk. Another was crying about a family emergency. A third was openly defiant, questioning Chun's authority and refusing to follow directions. Every instinct Chun had developed over 12 years screamed at him to assert dominance, to raise his voice, to use his rank like a weapon. Instead, he breathed. He recognized the stress response building in his body, the jaw tension, the shortened breath, and actively intervened. He lowered his voice instead of raising it. He found space for the crying soldier to collect himself. He de-escalated the defiant one by acknowledging his frustration before redirecting the conversation. Clear, Reeves announced after 45 minutes. Move to Scenario 2. Scenario 2 was worse. It involved a simulated emergency, a building fire with soldiers trapped inside. Chun had to coordinate evacuation while managing a subordinate who was actively panicking and making the situation worse. The subordinate, another actor, hit every trigger Chun possessed. She questioned his decisions. She froze at critical moments. She accused him of not caring about the trapped soldiers. Chun wanted to scream at her. The primal part of his brain demanded he grab her and shake sense into her. Instead, he breathed. He talked her through the panic. He gave her small, achievable tasks to restore her sense of agency. He never raised his voice beyond what the noise of the simulated emergency required. Clear. Scenario 3. Scenario 3 broke him. Not immediately, not obviously, but slowly, steadily, like water eroding rock. It began in a mock mess hall. The symbolism was unmistakable. Chun was positioned at the back of a long serving line, exhausted beyond description, having now been awake for more than 22 hours. The line moved with agonizing slowness. Every soldier ahead of him seemed to be taking twice as long as necessary. And then he saw her, a small woman in rumpled ACUs, no visible rank, standing at the serving station, not moving. For a terrible moment, Chen's sleep-deprived brain told him this was the same scenario, that General Kavik was testing him again, that this was literally the same situation, recreated perfectly to see if he would fail. The woman continued not moving. The soldiers behind Chen began to mutter. He could feel their impatience pressing against his back. His hands began to rise. And then he stopped, because he noticed details he'd missed before. The woman's shoulders were shaking slightly. She was crying, not spacing out. The serving soldier behind the counter was speaking to her quietly, with concern. And on her left hand, barely visible, was a wedding ring with a black band wrapped around it. Mourning band. She had lost someone. This wasn't obstruction. This was grief. Chen stepped forward, not to push, but to support. He placed himself beside her, not behind her, and spoke quietly. Ma'am, whatever you're going through, take the time you need. The line can wait. The woman looked up at him. Her face was tear-streaked, her eyes hollow with loss. He was my husband, she whispered. 3 days ago. Helicopter crash in Syria. This was the last place we ate together before he deployed. Chun felt his throat tighten. Then this is exactly where you should be, he said. And you should stay as long as you need. He turned to the line behind him, a line that included Sergeant Major Reeves, General Kavik in plain ACUs, and the civilian consultants who had guided his transformation. We're going to give her some space, Chin announced to the waiting soldiers. Anyone who has a problem with that can speak to me directly. No one spoke. The woman eventually collected herself, thanked Chin quietly, and departed without taking food. She hadn't come to eat. She'd come to remember. When she was gone, Reeves stepped forward. Exercise complete, he said. You pass. Chen's legs gave out. He sat heavily on the mess hall floor, not caring how it looked, not caring about anything except the profound relief flooding through his exhausted body. General Kavik crouched beside him. That woman is real, she said quietly. Sergeant First Class Maria Delgado. Her husband was killed 4 days ago, and she requested participate in your exercise. She wanted to see if you were different. Chin looked up. Was I? You tell me. And for the first time in 30 days, Chin smiled. The graduation ceremony took place at 0600 the following morning, exactly 30 days from Chen's first meeting with General Kavik. He stood in her office, wearing his dress uniform for the second time a month, but feeling entirely different than he had during that terrified first visit. Staff Sergeant Marcus Chun. Kavik began formally, reading from a document. You have successfully completed the Dignity through Leadership Development Program, demonstrating exceptional commitment to personal transformation and ethical growth. She set down the document. That's the official language. Here's the unofficial version. You didn't just survive this program, Chun. You exceeded it. The curriculum you helped develop is better than what I originally envisioned. Your teaching sessions evolved from disaster to inspiration, and your final exercise performance demonstrated genuine change. Not acting, not performing, but change. Thank you, ma'am. I'm not finished. She pulled a second folder from her desk. During your program, I submitted a recommendation to the Centralized Promotion Board. Normally, recommendations from installation commanders carry significant weight. In your case, I also included documentation of your participation in an intensive leadership development initiative, without specifying its nature. Chen's heart rate accelerated. This morning, I received confirmation. Staff Sergeant Marcus Chun has been selected for promotion to Sergeant First Class, below the zone, effective immediately. Chin stared at her. Below the zone promotions were rare, given to soldiers advancing faster than the normal timeline due to exceptional performance. He had expected to wait another 2 years for that rank. Ma'am, I don't. You do, Kavik interrupted. This isn't a reward for 1 month of work. This is recognition of 12 years of excellent service, combined with demonstrated capacity for growth that few soldiers ever show. The mess hall incident could have defined your career. Instead, you transformed it into something meaningful. She extended her hand. Chin shook it, the first physical contact with a general since the shove that had started everything. Now comes the hard part, Kavik said, releasing his hand. You're not done. You're just beginning. Over the following weeks, Chin learned what Kavik meant by beginning. The Dignity through Leadership curriculum didn't remain confined to Fort Bragg. Kavik had been developing the framework for years, and Chen's participation had provided the final element she'd been missing, authenticity. Theory is easy, she explained during a planning meeting. Anyone can write principles on a whiteboard, but soldiers respect lived experience. They respect failure that led to growth. Your story, the mess hall, the program, the transformation makes this curriculum real. The first external rollout occurred 6 weeks after Chen's graduation. He traveled to Fort Campbell, Kentucky, to deliver the curriculum to a pilot group of 40 NCOs from the 101st Airborne Division. The sessions were structured around his story, beginning with the mess hall incident and ending with the exercise that had proven his transformation. The response exceeded all expectations. Soldiers who had initially arrived skeptical, viewing another mandatory training as a waste of time, left with shifted perspectives. Feedback forms contained comments like first leadership training that felt honest, and finally, someone who admits mistakes instead of pretending to be perfect. Fort Campbell led to Fort Stewart. Fort Stewart led to Fort Carson. Fort Carson led to Joint Base Lewis McChord. Within 4 months, Chun had personally delivered the dignity through leadership curriculum to over 3,000 NCOs across 12 installations. Each session was slightly different, adapted to local culture and challenges, but the core remained constant: recognition, respect, responsibility, taught by a soldier who had failed at all three and rebuilt himself. The Army's senior leadership took notice. Sergeant Major of the Army Davis requested a personal briefing on the curriculum. Chun delivered a 90-minute presentation to the highest-ranking enlisted soldier in the service, walking through the framework, the teaching methodology, and the results. This started from a mess hall incident. Davis asked afterward, reviewing the impact metrics. "Yes, Sergeant Major. And the general who you incident-ed with, she designed all of this?" Chun hesitated. The question was more complicated than it appeared. Kavik had created the framework, but the curriculum's power came from the combination: her vision and his experience, her authority and his authenticity. She designed the framework, Sergeant Major. I became the case study that made it real. Neither element works without the other. Davis nodded slowly. I want this Army-wide within 18 months. Can you scale it? The next phase of Chen's transformation began. Scaling dignity through leadership required building an organization, not just delivering sessions. Chen recruited instructors, other NCOs who had experienced their own transformation moments and could speak authentically about failure and growth. He developed train-the-trainer materials, standardized assessment protocols, and created implementation guides for installation commanders. The work was exhausting, but it was the opposite of the exhaustion he'd felt during the 30-day program. That exhaustion had been destructive, breaking him down to rebuild. This exhaustion was constructive. Every hour spent created something that would outlast him. General Kavik remained involved throughout, providing strategic guidance and opening doors that Chen couldn't access. Their relationship evolved from commander-subordinate to something resembling colleagues, not equals in rank, but partners in mission. One evening, 12 months after the mess hall incident, Chen found himself back at Fort Bragg. He had returned to deliver a session at the installation where everything had begun, a symbolic full circle that Kavik had insisted upon. The mess hall looked exactly as he remembered. Same fluorescent lights, same serving stations, same industrial hum of ventilation. But when Chen walked through the doors, he was seeing it through different eyes. He stood at the spot where he had shoved a general and nearly ended his career. He remembered the exhaustion, the tunnel vision, the assumptions that had cascaded into catastrophe. And he remembered the woman who had offered him a choice instead of a punishment. Still reliving the glory days? Chun turned. General Kavik stood behind him, 2 stars gleaming on her uniform collar. She looked the same as she had a year ago, weathered, perceptive, with those evaluating eyes that seemed to see everything. Something like that, ma'am. She walked to stand beside him, surveying the mess hall. Evening chow was in full swing. Soldiers moving to the serving line with the controlled chaos Chun remembered from that night. 15,000, Kavik said quietly. Ma'am, that's how many NCOs have completed the curriculum as of this morning. 15,347, across 47 installations. Chun absorbed the number. When he had stood in this spot 12 months ago, he had been one soldier, a single point of failure. Now, through the curriculum that failure had spawned, he had influenced 15,000 others. We received formal adoption by Tradic last week, Kavik continued. Dignity through leadership is now part of the standard NCO professional development track. Every sergeant and above will complete it as part of their career progression. That's Chin struggled for words. That's the entire NCO Corps. Eventually, Kavik agreed. Millions of soldiers, over years, all because you made the worst decision of your career in this room. Chun laughed, a genuine, surprised sound. That's a hell of a way to frame it, ma'am. It's the truth. If you hadn't shoved me that night, I would have finished my anonymous observation and begun my command through normal channels. I would have developed dignity through leadership eventually, but without the case study that made it real, your failure, your transformation became the cornerstone that made everything else possible. She turned to face him directly. I've been doing this for 30 years, Chun. 3 decades of command, combat, and leadership. I've trained thousands of soldiers and led hundreds in battle. But this She gestured at the mess hall, at the installation beyond, at everything they'd built together. This might be the most significant thing I've ever done. And I couldn't have done it without you. Without my worst moment, you mean. Without your willingness to transform that moment into something better. Kavik's expression was serious. Failure is common. Everyone fails. What's rare is the courage to face failure honestly, submit to reconstruction, and emerge as someone capable of helping others avoid the same mistakes. That's what you did. That's what this program does. That's why it matters. They stood in silence for a moment, watching soldiers move through the mess hall, soldiers who had no idea they were being observed by the installation's commanding general and the NCO who had founded an army-wide transformation program in this exact spot. I have one more thing for you, Kavik said. She reached into her uniform pocket and produced a small box. Inside was a challenge coin, not the standard unit coin that soldiers collected, but something more personal. On one side was a Dignity Through Leadership emblem. On the other was an inscription, SSG Chin Day Zero. Day Zero, Chin read. The mess hall incident, the moment everything changed. For both of us, Chin accepted the coin. It was small, maybe 2 inches in diameter, but it carried weight far beyond its physical mass. Thank you, ma'am, for everything. Don't thank me yet. Kavik's expression shifted to something more serious. I'm retiring in 18 months. The Army wants someone to continue leading the Dignity Initiative after I'm gone, expanding it beyond NCOs, potentially adapting it for officer development, integrating it into joint force training with other services. Chin understood where this was going. Ma'am, the position requires field grade rank. You'd need to complete officer candidate school, commission as a second lieutenant, and work your way back up. It would take years. The work would be harder than anything you've done. She met his eyes. Are you interested? Chun thought about the question. He had spent 13 years as an enlisted soldier, rising from private to sergeant first class through sweat, sacrifice, and one spectacular failure that had somehow become his greatest asset. Transitioning to officer would mean starting over in many ways. New rank structure, new responsibilities, new relationships with the enlisted soldiers he'd spent his career among. It would be the hardest thing he'd ever done. Yes, ma'am, he said. I'm interested. Kavik smiled, the first genuine, warm smile he'd ever seen from her. Good. Report to my office tomorrow at 0800. We have work to do. The officer candidacy process took 18 months. Chun completed OCS at Fort Moore, Georgia, enduring the strange experience of being outranked by drill sergeants who had been his peers just months before. He commissioned as a second lieutenant at age 36, older than most of his classmates, but carrying experiences none of them possessed. His first assignment as an officer was deliberate, the Dignity Through Leadership Program Office, now formally established as a component of TRADOC. He served initially as a junior staff officer, learning the administrative and strategic elements of program management that his enlisted experience had never required. The work was different than teaching. As an NCO instructor, Chen had stood in front of soldiers and shared his story directly. As an officer administrator, he spent more time in meetings, reviewing metrics, and navigating institutional bureaucracy. But both roles served the same purpose, expanding the program's reach and deepening its impact. General Kavik retired as scheduled, but not before ensuring Chen's continued involvement. Her final act as a general officer was recommending him for accelerated promotion consideration, a recommendation that carried considerable weight given their history. 2 years after commissioning, Chen pinned on captain's bars. 3 years after that, he made major. Each promotion came faster than normal, the same below-the-zone trajectory he'd experienced as an enlisted soldier, driven by exceptional performance and a unique position he occupied in Army culture. Because Chen wasn't just a program administrator. He was a symbol, the soldier who had shoved a general and been transformed rather than destroyed. The living proof that failure could become foundation. The authentic voice that made dignity through leadership more than theory. His speaking engagements grew from installations to commands to Pentagon briefings. He addressed joint force audiences, teaching principles that transcended service boundaries. He consulted with international partners, adapting the curriculum for coalition training. He published articles in military professional journals and was interviewed by civilian media outlets covering military culture transformation. Each time someone new learned his story, the same pattern repeated. Initial skepticism. How could someone who had physically assaulted a general be trusted to teach respect? Then engagement, hearing the details, understanding the transformation. Then acceptance, recognizing that his failure was a source of his authority, not its impediment. The numbers grew. 20,000 NCOs trained, then 30,000, then 50. The curriculum expanded beyond NCOs to include officer professional development and eventually senior enlisted leadership courses. Adaptations were created for recruiters, drill sergeants, and military instructors, anyone whose interactions with soldiers shaped Army culture. 10 years after the mess hall incident, Major Marcus Chin stood at a podium in the Pentagon, delivering a keynote address to the assembled senior leadership of all 4 military services. His audience included 4-star generals, the Sergeant Major of the Army, and civilian officials from the Department of Defense. His topic, Dignity as Strategic Asset, How Culture Transformation Enhances Military Readiness. In my 13th year of Army service, Chin began, I committed an act that should have ended my career. I physically shoved a 2-star general in a mess hall because I assumed she was a junior soldier blocking my dinner. My exhaustion wasn't the cause, it was the catalyst. The cause was a failure of character I had never examined. He described General Kavik, the choice she had offered, the brutal program that had reconstructed him, the curriculum that had emerged from his failure. 15,000 NCOs completed this program in its first year, he said. Today, that number exceeds 200,000. Soldiers across 47 installations in 19 countries, each one challenged to examine the assumptions they make about the people around them. He paused, letting the number settle. Military readiness isn't just equipment and training. It's culture. It's how soldiers treat each other when no one's watching. It's whether junior personnel feel valued or dismissed. It's whether mistakes are punished or transformed. General Kavik understood this before I did. She saw that changing one soldier could ripple outward indefinitely if that soldier was willing to be honest about their failure and committed to genuine change. He met the eyes of his audience, generals, senior NCOs, civilian officials. Every one of you has soldiers in your command who are one bad decision away from the end of their careers. Some will make those decisions from malice, and they deserve the consequences. But some will make them from exhaustion, stress, or failures of character they've never examined. Those soldiers have a choice if someone offers it to them. He stepped back from the podium. My worst moment became my greatest legacy. That's not luck. It's leadership. The leadership that gave me a chance to transform. The leadership I'm now asking you to extend to your own soldiers. The applause that followed lasted longer than any speech Chin had delivered. But the real impact came afterward in the conversations and commitments that rippled through the services. 3 years later, Lieutenant Colonel Marcus Chun received orders for a new assignment. The position was unprecedented. Director of Character Development, a newly created role spanning all military services and reporting directly to the Joint Chiefs of Staff. His mission was to expand dignity through leadership into dignity through service, a joint force initiative encompassing not just Army culture, but the culture of the entire American military. The scale was staggering. 2 million active duty personnel across all services, nearly 1 million reservists and National Guard members, hundreds of thousands of civilian employees. Each population required adapted curriculum, specialized instructors, and institutional buy-in from leadership structures that had operated independently for generations. Chin assembled a team, officers and NCOs from all services, each selected because they possessed a combination of professional excellence and authentic failure that made dignity effective. A Marine Corps gunnery sergeant who had been relieved of command after a leadership failure and rebuilt herself through deliberate growth. A Navy chief petty officer who had nearly been court-martialed for treatment of junior sailors and emerged as the fleet's leading advocate for enlisted welfare. An Air Force major who had crashed her career through toxic leadership and spent 3 years learning to lead differently. Each one understood what Chin understood. That failure wasn't the end, but it could be the beginning if someone offered the chance. The Joint Force rollout took 5 years. Chin spent those years in near constant motion, visiting installations, speaking commands, navigating bureaucratic obstacles, and fighting institutional resistance from leaders who believed military culture didn't need transformation. Some battles he won, some he lost, But the trajectory was always upward, always expanding, always reaching more soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines who needed to hear that character could be rebuilt if you were brave enough to try. During those years, Chin maintained contact with Sarah Kavik. She had retired to a small house in Texas, where she spent her days writing memoirs and advising young officers who sought her counsel. Their conversations evolved from mentorship to friendship, two people who had shared an experience that neither fully understood until they examined it together. "I've been thinking about the mess hall," Chin said during one visit, sitting on her porch as Texas sunset painted the sky. "Which part?" "The moment I decided to shove you. It wasn't just exhaustion. It was something deeper. I looked at you and saw someone who didn't matter, who wasn't worth my patience or respect. And that reaction came from somewhere inside me that I'd never examined." Kavik nodded slowly. "Where do you think it came from?" "I've spent 15 years asking that question." Chun watched the sunset. "I think it came from every time someone bigger or higher ranking than me treated me the same way. Basic training drill sergeants who saw recruits as obstacles. Combat leaders who valued mission over people. An institutional culture that taught me rank meant worth and appearance meant status. And now I understand that I was perpetuating what had been done to me, passing down the toxicity I'd absorbed without realizing it. When I shoved you, I was being the worst version of every leader who had ever dismissed me." "That's the insight," Kavik said quietly, "the one most soldiers never reach. We don't just lead, we echo. Every interaction we have with a subordinate reflects every interaction we've had with our own superiors. If we don't consciously break the cycle, we perpetuate it." She turned to face him. "That's what dignity through service really is, Marcus. It's not just teaching respect. It's teaching soldiers to examine where their instincts come from and to choose consciously instead of reacting automatically." Chin absorbed her words. After all these years, she was still teaching him. "I never properly thanked you," he said, "for offering me the choice instead of the punishment." Kavik smiled. "You've thanked me every day for 15 years. Every soldier you've trained, every leader you've developed, every career you've saved by showing them transformation is possible. That's thanks. That's legacy." She reached into her pocket and produced something Chin hadn't seen in years, the day's zero challenge coin she'd given him in the Fort Bragg mess hall. "I had a matching one made," she said, holding up an identical coin. "I carry it every day. Reminds me that sometimes the worst moments are really beginnings." Chun held his own coin, worn now from years of handling, but still legible. Day 0, the beginning of everything. On the 20th anniversary of the mess hall incident, Colonel Marcus Chin stood in Building 4, the 2788 at Fort Liberty, the installation's new name, though soldiers still called it Fort Bragg when commanders weren't listening. The mess hall had been renovated 3 times since that night, but the bones were the same. Same basic layout. Same serving line configuration. Same spot where a 34-year-old staff sergeant had made the worst decision of his career. Except now that spot held a plaque. Dignity through service. Origination site. This location marks where Major General Sarah Kavik and Staff Sergeant Marcus Chun began a transformation that would reshape military culture across all services. Characters revealed, not created by adversity. The dedication ceremony had drawn hundreds of attendees, soldiers who had completed the program, leaders who had implemented it, families who had felt its ripple effects. General Kavik attended, now 84 years old, but still carried herself with the posture of someone who had once led soldiers through the Karengal Valley. Chun had delivered remarks. Kavik had delivered remarks. The Sergeant Major of the Army had delivered remarks. But the most meaningful part came afterward, when the crowds dispersed and Chin found himself alone at the serving counter where everything had begun. He was 61 years old now, retired from active duty, but still advising the program he'd helped create. His hair had gone gray. His body ached from decades of military service. But his mind remained sharp, still processing the strange journey from catastrophic failure to lasting legacy. "Colonel Chen?" He turned. A young woman in unmarked ACU stood behind him, probably a new arrival, based on her uncertain posture. She was small, maybe 5'4", with the particular tension of someone encountering something they didn't fully understand. For a moment, Chin saw Sarah Kavik as she had appeared 20 years ago. The parallel was unmistakable. "Can I help you?" he asked. I'm sorry to bother you, sir. I read the plaque, and I recognize your name from the curriculum. She hesitated. You're the one who shoved the general. I'm struggling, sir. I made a mistake in my unit. Not as bad as yours, but bad enough. My commander offered me a choice, administrative action or professional development program. I chose the program, but she trailed off. I don't know if I can do it. I don't know if I'm capable of the kind of change you made. Chin studied her for a long moment. What's your name? Private First Class Martinez, sir. Martinez? He gestured toward a table. Sit with me for a minute. They sat. Chun collected his thoughts. 20 years ago, I stood in this exact spot and committed the act that should have ended my career. I was exhausted, stressed, and operating on assumptions I'd never examined. When I shoved General Kavik, I wasn't just being rude. I was revealing who I really was when no one was watching. Martinez listened intently. The program she offered me was brutal. 30 days of dual duty on 3 hours of sleep. Teaching material I'd failed to embody. Being tested repeatedly until I broke. And then rebuilt. There were moments I wanted to quit. Moments I was certain I couldn't continue. How did you get through it? I didn't at first. I failed repeatedly. But each failure taught me something about myself I'd never understood. And eventually, I stopped failing the same way. I started recognizing my stress responses before they took over. I started seeing the people around me as humans instead of obstacles. He leaned forward. Martinez, I can't tell you whether you're capable of change. That's not something anyone can determine in advance. What I can tell you is that the capacity for change exists in every human being, if they're brave enough to face their failures honestly and submit to the work of reconstruction. It sounds painful. It's the most painful thing you'll ever do, and also the most important. Chin met her eyes. The person you are right now made a mistake. The person you could become might not make that mistake again. The only way to find out is to do the work. Martinez was silent for a long moment. Did you ever regret it, sir? The program? The transformation? Chin thought about the question, really thought about it, as he had countless times over 20 years. I regret the shove, he said finally. I regret being the kind of person who could do that, but I don't regret what came after. Because what came after reached 200,000 soldiers. It changed military culture across every service. It saved careers and possibly lives by teaching leaders to see the people they command as human beings worthy of dignity. He reached into his pocket and produced his day's 0 coin, worn smooth now but still legible. This coin represents my worst moment. I carry it every day because my worst moment became my greatest legacy. That transformation is possible for you too, Martinez, but you have to choose it. You have to want it badly enough to endure the pain. Martinez looked at the coin, then at Chun, then at the plaque on the wall commemorating this exact spot. I want to try, she said quietly. Then try. That's all any of us can do. She rose to leave, but paused at the doorway. Thank you, Colonel, for sharing your story. For all of this. Chin nodded. Go be better than I was. Martinez. That's all the thanks I need. She left. Chin remained seated, watching soldiers move through the mess hall as they had for decades. Eating, talking, existing in the rhythms of military life. Somewhere among them was the next failure waiting to happen. The next soldier who would make assumptions about the people around them. The next catastrophic decision born of exhaustion and unexamined character. But also among them, somewhere, was the next transformation. The next leader who would face their failure honestly and rebuild themselves into something better. That was the real legacy, not the plaque on the wall or the curriculum in the training manual. The real legacy was a possibility. The proof that everyone mattered, that character could change, and that the worst moments would become the foundation for everything that followed. Colonel Marcus Chun, retired, sat in the mess hall where his life had changed and smiled. The sun rose over Fort Liberty, painting the sky gold and crimson, and the mess hall began another day, another opportunity, another beginning. Everyone mattered. Everyone could change. That was the lesson. That was the legacy. And it had started right here with a shove.